When dissatisfaction with both Democrats and Republicans is at an all-time high, third-party candidates have struggled to have their voices heard. Case in point is Maryland Green Party Senate candidate Margaret Flowers. Earlier this week, she stormed the stage during a debate between Democrat candidate Chris Van Hollen and Republican nominee State Delegate Kathy Zaliga.
It's not a full discussion if you don't have all viewpoints included, and I'm a ballot candidate on the ballot, so I hope you, and I appreciate you allowing me to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. If you don't mind leaving the stage at this point so that we can continue with this organized debate.
I'm a candidate on the ballot. I have a statewide campaign. I don't understand why I'm not here. I add a lot of the discussion.
The rules are pretty much...
There's been a very welcoming embrace of the discussion. We get a full range. I think it's important for voters to understand the differences between myself and Congressman Van Hollen and Delegate Zaliga. Otherwise, they don't really know. I mean, you say you're a public university and you want to educate the public, but without having a full public discussion, that doesn't actually happen. So how does this serve democracy or serve the public if I'm excluded from this discussion when I'm on the ballot?
Part of the problem for Flowers is polling. The latest has her at 5%, short of the 15% threshold needed to qualify to participate.
This is how they're treating. This is why our democracy is a shame.
Can we open this? Can we open this podium to her?
But the Real News Network is committed to giving candidates like Flowers a platform to make their case directly to you, which is why she's joining us tonight as we live stream our conversation with her about the debate, policy, and what the Green Party can offer that other parties cannot. So Margaret Flowers is now live with us in the studio, and I'm Jess Lenore. Margaret Flowers is the Green Party Senate candidate running for Barbara Mikulski's Senate seat in Maryland. She's on the Green Party ticket and on the ballot. She's a pediatrician in the Baltimore area, a co-chair of the Maryland chapter of Physicians for a National Health Program, and also co-director of popularresistance.org and It's Our Economy. Thanks for being with us again, Margaret.
Thank you so much for having me, Jessel.
So we have to start off by getting your reaction, your response, your thoughts to being escorted off the stage at the sole televised debate for the U.S. Senate seat. And so the reason you weren't allowed to participate, you met just about all the other qualifications, but you didn't quite get 15%. The latest polls have you around 5%, which is actually an increase to the other polls. But start off by giving us your reaction. I think it's you made a bold statement there, and what you said sort of went viral. It was covered way more than the local media or the national media has paid attention to your campaign.
Yeah, so the reality is that 15% polling criterion was used to justify excluding me from the debate. Initially, they didn't even contact me to say that they were going to hold a debate, to inform me that they had certain criterion. But then I found out about it and I got in touch with them, and they said, oh, well, we're going to make our decision by September 16th, and here are our criteria. You need to be on the ballot, have an office with staff, a statewide campaign, and if there's a poll, you need to be polling at better than 15%. Well, at the time of September 16th, there was no poll, so I met all the criteria. But we found out just that week that Goucher was going to be doing the first poll that included me, and so then they said, oh, we're going to wait for that poll. We're going to just delay the date of our decision until mid-October. And so I complained about that because really, in reality, polls don't really mean anything when people don't know who you are. And the Washington Post has not covered me at all. The Baltimore Sun has had minimal coverage. And I don't have the millions of dollars to go out there and reach millions of voters. So having a debate where people can actually compare us head to head is the best way for people to know what my positions are. And then it makes sense to poll.
Absolutely. So that's why we are expanding the debate. We're going to let you respond to the questions that were asked in the debate of the two candidates that were also on the ticket that were allowed to participate in that debate. And so we're going to sort of play with the similar rules, give you about 90 seconds for each response, starting off by the opening statements that both candidates gave. We have that clip lined up. Let's go to that.
Great.
It's great to be here, and thanks everybody for watching. During my time in public service, I have listened to Maryland families and worked with them to deliver real results for our community and for our state. That's why I teamed up with our PTAs to win a historic investment in Maryland schools, and why I've worked with our veterans to support our wounded warriors at Walter Reed, and with the Maryland Watermen to prohibit oil drilling around the Chesapeake Bay. And I'm proud to have led the fight to protect the promise of Social Security and Medicare from Tea Party budget cuts. So I know when to fight. I also know when to find common ground, because we can't allow division in Washington to block all progress for Maryland families. And we can't allow the poisonous message of Donald Trump to tear us apart. We've got to work together. Senator Mikulski has been a great senator. I'm proud to have her support. And like Senator Mikulski, I'm focused on getting things done for Marylanders. Thank you for listening this evening.
Now, Ms. Shalega.
I'm Kathy Shalega, and I'm running to be Maryland's next United States Senator. You see, Washington is broken, and somewhere along the line, government has stopped working for us. Year after year, politicians make election year promises, yet they fail to deliver on most of them. My opponent's been in Washington for 14 years. Over that time, the debt has more than tripled, raising to almost $20 trillion. Healthcare expenses are crippling our families, and we watch Obamacare, the healthcare exchange, collapse before our eyes. He supported an $800 billion taxpayer bailout of Wall Street, and he also supported the Iran deal, which makes America less safe, and certainly Israel. You know, now my opponent wants a promotion to the Senate, and this Baltimore Hun says no way. I'm a wife, mother, grandmother, and a small business owner. I know what it means to sign the front of a paycheck, and I know what it means to balance a budget. I'm an independent voice that wants to go to Washington and fight for you.
I'm sorry your time is up.
All right, Margaret, so you just heard the opening statements of Chris Van Hollen and Kathy Shalega. You're up next.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm Dr. Margaret Flowers. I'm a pediatrician. I came to Baltimore in 1986 for medical school at the University of Maryland, and then did my pediatric residency at Johns Hopkins. I was then in practice for 17 years, but it became very clear that our healthcare system is not about health at all. It's about profits for the private insurance companies, the pharmaceutical industries, and it's driving physicians to not be able to provide the high quality care they want to provide, and it's driving especially primary care physicians out of practice within 10 to 15 years. So I left practice in 2007 to advocate full-time for a national improved Medicare for all health system. And I was in Congress in 2009, 2010 fighting for that at a time when so many groups were fighting for the Affordable Care Act that we knew was going to be not solve the fundamental crises that we have. But in my time in Congress, I saw that both the Democrats and the Republican parties are controlled by big money, and they're not interested in solutions that go against their campaign funders. And so since then, my whole journey has been, how do we build political power for the fundamental changes that we need? And I see that as part of social movement, and that's why I've been involved in popular resistance for so long, where we've run a number of campaigns, some of them very successful, but also having an electoral voice and building an alternative party that doesn't take any of that corporate or PAC money. And so that's why I'm a Green Party candidate, and I feel like that's the important ingredient that we need to build up right now, because voting for Democrats and Republicans is not going to bring us the change that we need.
All right, Margaret, thanks so much, and you were right on time, and we'll try to keep you to that 90-second window. And so we're going to go through some of the questions that the moderators asked both candidates on stage, and we're also going to get questions from our audience as well. So please, if you are watching on Facebook, watching on our site, please send us your questions. We will try to get to them all. But I want to start off on another topic, because this is something the Real News has been covering really closely, and we have reporters on the ground right now in North Dakota, and we've just gotten word from the AP that authorities have cleared off the encampments by the water defenders. And we have footage from it from earlier, and we have reports from our correspondents that the police were using violence, may have even used live ammunition against horse riders and horses. That was witnessed by some of our correspondents there. What is your position on what is happening right now in North Dakota? Let's start off there.
It's very concerning, and actually I was watching some of the live feed this afternoon as that was happening, and in fact I called the governor of North Dakota, and actually they weren't answering the phone and his messages were full. So then I called the sheriff of Morton County and was able to talk to somebody and expressed my concern and asked them to remove the police, that the water protectors are fighting for our environment, they're fighting for a livable future to protect our water, and that, you know, sometimes the laws are wrong, and it's wrong. And I've been through this here in Maryland with the Dominion project down in Cove Point in southern Maryland, where Dominion literally lied to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission about the number of people that live in that area. And so they're placing a gas refinery and an export terminal literally in a neighborhood where there are 2,400 families in a 2-mile radius. And if there's an explosion, they are not going to be able to escape. So I know that that system doesn't work and that we need to keep our fossil fuels in the ground. And so I'm strongly supportive of those who are standing up and placing their bodies on the line and resisting this project. And I think that the police would be wise to stand down and understand that these people are fighting for all of us.
So that was not a question that was asked at the official event, but we thought that it was important to raise that issue.
Thank you.
That is a key issue today in the United States and internationally as well. So the moderators started off by asking both candidates if they had any misgivings about endorsing their party's nominee in light of the fact that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton have some of the highest unpopularity ratings ever.
And this is so interesting because for decades now, people have been voting for the lesser evil. And this is the result that we have as the two most unliked presidential candidates that we can remember. That's why it's so important that we build this political alternative. And the Green Party is a strong national party that doesn't take any corporate or PAC money. So I know Dr. Jill Stein, our presidential candidate, very well. She's a medical doctor who's worked for a long time on environmental and nutritional issues and has been running as a Green for, gosh, over a decade now. And then Ajamu Baraka, her vice presidential candidate, is an internationally recognized human rights defender who has helped to negotiate peace agreements. He was very instrumental in the one that they're trying to put forth in Colombia. And that's exactly what we need right now, is a White House that understands how to respect human rights, how to be a player in a multipolar world, a cooperative player. And so I think it's really exciting that we have Dr. Stein and Ajamu Baraka. And I hope that I'll be in the Senate to work with them.
And to follow up on that, some people have sort of criticized Jill Stein for saying there is no difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. There's no difference between Democrats and Republicans. But in the opening statements, Kathy Zulaga, she singled out the Iran nuclear agreement that President Obama signed, something that Donald Trump has also highlighted. And Chris Van Hollen voted for it. He supports it now, and Hillary Clinton says she'll keep it. And many people say that's been a key thing in preventing nuclear war in the Middle East, because we are de-escalating some of the tensions that existed before with Iran. So I just wanted to ask you about that. As far as foreign policy goes, do you think that, what's your stance on that?
Well, first off, let me quickly say that nobody's saying that the Republicans and Democrats are exactly alike. But what we're saying is that neither one of them are going to solve the crises that we face, and that, well, I won't get into the personalities, they're different personalities, but in terms of the what's going on in the Middle East right now, we have to recognize that the United States has a long history of interference in the Middle East, of coups going all the way back to Mossadegh in Iran in the early 1950s, and that we haven't really been a force to help stabilize that area. So I have a lot of, I'm glad that we created the Iran deal and pursued a diplomatic solution in that situation. But I don't think that the United States is being completely honest about the situation there and is trying to portray Iran in a negative light when we don't have evidence that they were actually pursuing nuclear weapons. So I think it's very important that the United States stop using sanctions as a punitive measure. We have international law that helps guide us in these issues. We need to be respecting the international law, respecting the human rights and the sovereignty of other countries, and that will help us to bring a more peaceful and stable Middle East, which will make all of us safer.
So we want to go to another clip from the debate. The issue of Obamacare and the increases, I think some 25% is what people's premiums are going to go up by next year. I wanted to play a bit of their response from both candidates on that question.
The Affordable Care Act has been much in the news in the last week with reports of soaring premiums in the individual market. What changes, if any, would you make to the Affordable Care Act?
Well, I think we do need to make revisions and modifications to the Affordable Care Act, especially as it relates to the exchanges. But it would be a big mistake to throw out the entire Affordable Care Act rather than try and fix it. The Affordable Care Act has allowed families to keep their kids on their insurance policies till they're 26 years old. The Affordable Care Act closed the prescription drug donut hole that meant that seniors with high prescription drug costs were going to go bankrupt before paying for what they needed.
This is a clear difference between my opponent and myself. The Affordable Care Act has turned out to be anything but affordable. We know that next week our families are going to receive their statements with their new premiums. We know they're going up double digits. We also know that the Maryland Health Exchange has just 2 providers in our rural areas. One of them is Evergreen, and we know from reading your paper, the Baltimore Sun, that Evergreen is on thin ice right now and may not be able to survive, as most of the co-ops have not survived.
So, Margaret, you touched upon this issue in your opening statement, but I want to give you a chance to follow up on what both candidates said about the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare.
Right, I appreciate that. We have to understand that the Affordable Care Act, which was literally written by the insurance industry with input from the pharmaceutical and big business interests, is fundamentally flawed. And this is the problem in the United States, is that for the last 40 years we've used a market-based approach to health care to treat it as a commodity where people get as much as they can afford, instead of as a public good where we create an actual health system where the bottom line is health. And so what I support is what the majority of people in the United States support, what the majority of doctors support, which is a national improved Medicare for all health care system, which would actually be the smallest step that we could take to move in a direction that's positive, that's going to save money, provide high-quality coverage for everybody, and improve our health outcomes. So as a senator, one of my first actions will be to introduce the companion bill in the Senate to H.R. 676, which is the House Expanded and Improved Medicare for All Act, and not just to introduce it, but to really fight for it. I've worked a lot with the national movement for this, and so this is the time. We can't fix the Affordable Care Act. We'll just keep throwing money at it, and it will never become universal, guaranteed, or affordable.
That's something that you've been warning our viewers in the Real News for a long time, and I think this is certainly an issue that is going to be vital in the next few years as well. So
absolutely,
we appreciate that. Another question that was asked was whether the candidates would support military intervention in Syria. And both said no, they would not at the current time. What's your response to that?
Well, what they both said was that they would not support ground troops in Syria. Unfortunately, Hillary Clinton has said that she would support creating a no-fly zone over Syria, and we know that Chris Van Hollen has been very supportive of Hillary Clinton's positions, and actually said in his editorial review board interview with the Baltimore Sun that he supports the president's military agenda. So that has me very concerned, because already the United States is giving a lot of misinformation about Russia. We're being aggressive towards Russia. We're lining up military weapons on their border. We're doing military exercises to antagonize them. And now if we go forward with a no-fly zone at a time when we're already decreasing our trust with the Russian government, that will be really an escalation in conflict. And I'm concerned with Hillary Clinton's history that she will not hesitate to take us into a greater conflict with Russia, which is a nuclear-armed country. And so I think this is very dangerous, and that the solution to what's happening in Syria is to first, the U.S. has got to say that our goal is not regime change, which is too often our goal. We need to respect their sovereignty. I'm not saying that I like Bashar al-Assad, but he is the recognized leader of that country right now. We need to cut off the funding to the military, to the fighters in Syria. We need to cut off the weapons, and then we need to support a path towards peace, which civil society groups and others in Syria are trying to put together.
So, Margaret, a follow-up to that. The critics of that position would say, well, we can cut off our funding, but Russia and other outside players, Saudi Arabia, what if they still keep funding the sides that they support? Isn't that just going to lead to the people we support being defeated? How do you?
It's an excellent question. We need to really work with people in the region, with other countries in the region, as well as with Russia, to negotiate a peaceful path of reducing support towards those forces that are radical and extremist, and supporting the groups that are, well, really supporting the people, making sure the refugees are taken care of and the people who live in Syria are able to meet their basic needs. And then they can stabilize and they'll be able to deal with the situation. But yeah, I think that we can negotiate that if we're an honest player, which we really haven't been.
So again, we are live at the Real News Studios right now. Please send us your questions, tweet at us at The Real News, comment on Facebook, on the Facebook Live video if you're watching. We want to know what you want to ask Margaret Flowers, so send those questions in. We will try to ask them all. And so unlike the presidential debate, the issue of climate change was raised, And both candidates sort of gave their answers. Chris Van Hollen supports capping carbon emissions. Zaliga seemed a little doubtful of climate science, although she said we have to listen to scientists. But she said, we can't afford to lose jobs. And she actually pointed to the mountains of coal you see in the harbor in Baltimore and says, we can't stop exporting fossil fuels like coal. What is your position on climate change, and how urgent of a risk do you feel that that is today?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. So this is another area where I differ significantly from both of the candidates. The climate science is pretty clear, and in fact, the models that have been used to predict the extent of the climate crisis have fallen short. And instead, we're seeing an escalation in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's past 400 parts per million, and people do not think it's going to fall below that now. We're seeing rapid melting of the Arctic ice, and they're predicting a 9-foot rise in the oceans, as well as chronic flooding. So we need to do something now. And having a cap and dividend on carbon is a market-based solution that is not going to be sufficient. We need, what we're calling for in the Green Party is what we call a Green New Deal, where we set clear goals to be on 100% renewable energy by 2030, strive to achieve that. Combine that with other things that we need to do in terms of changing our food production, our agricultural practices, building up our wetlands, making a more comprehensive and affordable electrified transportation system, and increasing building efficiency. If we do this as a public works program, it will create tens of millions of healthy living wage jobs. And if we use it as a public investment with a public return, over time it can create a guaranteed basic income, which would immediately end poverty in this country. It's something that we desperately need.
Another topic that was raised was the affordability of higher education. What's your position on that?
I have 3 children in college, so I understand that. We have really strangled a whole generation of people with student debt, and we know that it's predatory student debt in many cases. And so what we're calling for is if we can bail out Wall Street to the tune of $16 trillion or more dollars when they were responsible for crashing the economy, that we can bail out our students with, it's less than $2 trillion to erase student debt. And that would allow those who are crippled by that to then immediately participate in the economy, and it will help to stimulate our economy from the bottom up. We need to work as well towards free public higher education, because we know that when we invest in higher education, we get a 7-fold return on that dollar. And then I have a lot of concerns about, primary and secondary education as well, and the privatization of that. Unlike Chris Van Hollen, I do not see the Every Student Succeeds Act as a solution. It's actually, it's decreasing the standards that we would hold our teachers to, and decreasing their training, which they don't want. We need career teachers that are skilled and have professional development support. And then we also need to make sure that we have open enrollment public schools so that everybody has access to a high quality education. So this is an area that, we need to do a lot of work.
And we have some of our first questions coming in from Facebook, and one of them, a viewer wants to know what is your position on the Voting Rights Act, which was recently gutted a few years ago by the Supreme Court, and this is going to be our first presidential election without the full force of the Voting Rights Act, ensuring access to voting in many states around the country. Yeah,
I've been in countries where actually the law says that if you don't vote, you have to get an excuse to not vote, and that they do the voting on Sundays, and they don't sell any alcohol that whole weekend to make sure that everybody's ready on Sunday and clear-headed and ready to go and vote. And I think that in the United States, we have a lot of work to do to make sure that our elections are free and fair. And one of them that I support is universal voter registration. Whenever anybody turns 18, they need to be automatically registered to vote. We need to remove barriers to vote. And I also agree that people who are in prison should have the right to vote as well. This is their, society too, and we need to do a lot of work on our prison system in general to make it more rehabilitative. I won't go into that. But I support removing barriers to allow people to vote.
And in some, our viewers may or may not be aware of this, but in places like Argentina, I believe, there's actually a tax if you don't vote. So there's actually mandates to encourage voting.
Right, and in the United States, I think it's about a quarter of the voting, eligible population that actually participates in our elections, and you can't have a democracy with that level of, of non-participation.
And so we have some more questions coming in from Facebook. how will you support a transition to green energy while respecting current fossil fuel workers? That was a key point made by Kathy Zalaga.
Yeah, and that's a critical question. I'm glad that somebody asked that because I support a just transition for workers. And so as we move through public investment in a program to move to 100% renewable energy, we need to provide retraining and support for our workers so that they can participate in this new economy.
We have another question about GMO labeling. Do you support GMO labeling?
Absolutely. I have a lot of concerns about GMO foods, and I've been very, forthright about this. There's science coming out showing a lot of concerns around glyphosate or Roundup, which is the pesticide that's sprayed on many GMO foods, and that's kind of the purpose in many cases of GMO, is to allow more pesticides to be used, and now we're creating super weeds and a lot of problems. So I think we need to move, as part of our food transition, move to a new type of agriculture that's being used around the world in the United States, regenerative agriculture that actually builds up the nutritional value of the soil and sequesters carbon and allows us to use organic farming so that we don't need GMO. You know, I also am very opposed to the whole patenting of seeds and control of seeds. We need a diverse stock of seeds, and that's how we have the strongest agricultural system, and unfortunately we're going in the wrong direction with that.
And so the questions are coming in from Facebook.
Right.
So William asks, what is your stance on voting for the lesser of two evils and your position on ranked choice voting? And you addressed the
Yeah,
lesser
I
evils,
stopped
but-
voting lesser evil a while ago, and I encourage other people to do that as well. It's just driven us in a race to the bottom. And what was the second part of that?
And they also wanted to know, what is your position on ranked choice voting?
Oh, ranked choice voting. Yeah, I think that's one thing that would be helpful in terms of it would allow people to vote for the person they want first, and then if that person doesn't win, their vote goes to their second choice. But there's a lot that we need to do to make our election system more free and fair, because right now there are significant barriers to third-party candidates. You see from my exclusion from the debate, and so I don't see that alone as the solution, but it certainly is one part of the solution.
And so just to explain for our viewers, that would mean that you could rank the top choices.
Right. You would say, I want this person first, and if they don't win, this person second. Yeah.
And so proposals for that have been blocked around the nation and some locally as well.
Well, you know who makes the rules. It's the two major parties. So.
It is, and they control the debates as well. We've seen that in
Exactly.
the presidential. We've covered the protests as well around the presidential debates as well.
Right.
So Chris asks, where do you stand on the criminal justice system? Does police brutality matter in how it's prosecuted as opposed to the same crimes committed by citizens?
Absolutely. This is a huge issue, and I have been involved, as you know, out in the streets with people and organizing against police brutality, and it's pervasive. I was out in Hagerstown last month where a young girl was assaulted by police and arrested, and very disturbing. There's a lot that we need to do, but that we can do, and especially at the federal level. So I see racial bias at all levels, from who's stopped to who's arrested to who's sentenced, and then the length of the sentences. We do see racial bias in that, and violence against our people. So at the federal level, I think it's time for us to legalize marijuana. We've seen at the state level that works, and we have so many people in our jails that are nonviolent marijuana users.
And it's been decriminalized statewide, but there's still a civil penalty.
Right. We also need to hold police accountable. We aren't going to change their behavior until we start holding them accountable. I look at it as a physician. If there was another doctor, or if I as a doctor was endangering someone's life, that I'm going to be held accountable for that. But a police officer, there's a whole culture of protection and not holding them accountable. So we need to investigate, have an independent investigation of every act of police violence and death within police custody, and then those who are responsible need to be held accountable for that. As well, we need to demilitarize our police. That's another thing we can do at the federal level. So the 1033, portion of the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, we need to pull that back and pull back the militarization of our police. And training is not the whole solution. I understand that, but this whole idea of warrior training needs to change. Instead, police need to see themselves as people who are protecting the community, not enemies of the community. And I support community control of police as well, although that's not a federal issue. We can certainly in Maryland do a lot of work as a senator. We can do reports, and we can do town hall meetings to hold this discussion with communities and push forward for that.
Absolutely. So we have another question from Brian. Pennsylvania just had a gasoline leak that dumped 55,000 gallons of gasoline into the Chesapeake Bay watershed. What steps would you take towards eliminating fertilizer runoff and reducing development in the watershed?
Right, yeah. I think that part of our program to deal with the climate crisis means that we really need to do a lot of work to build up our wetlands, to buffer our coast against the rising seas that we're going to see. And of course, you know that I support a moratorium on all new fossil fuel projects, moving to clean, renewable energy, and pulling back our fossil fuel and nuclear energy in the process. But pipeline companies need to be held accountable as well. Every pipe has leaked. And so there need to be, we need much stronger regulation of the fossil fuel industry. Right now, we don't have enough regulators to be checking on the infrastructure and make sure that they're responsible for their infrastructure being sound.
Another question that was raised in the debate was asked, what would you do about the national debt?
Yeah, so first, there's a number of things that we need to do about the national debt. One thing is that we need to stop the endless wars and pull our military bases back. We're building bases in places, in countries where the people do not want them and they're fighting against them. We spend more than 50% of our discretionary federal funds on the military budget, and we're creating greater insecurity in the world by being an antagonistic force instead of a cooperative member. So that's one thing. We also need to recognize that we don't need to create debt with our money, that the Constitution gives the United States government the power to print and make money. And instead, we've given that to the Federal Reserve so that all the money that we have in our federal, that we get from them is money that's created at debt. And then finally, we need to understand that we need to take steps to support our economy from the bottom up. That's why things like a guaranteed basic income, getting rid of student debt, supporting a massive national jobs program is so important, because it's obscene when you look at the levels of wealth inequality in this country. Right now, the 50% of the bottom 50% have 1% of the wealth, and the bottom 25% have negative wealth. They're in debt. We can't survive when people can't even pay for their basic needs. So we need to have a lot of investment at the Main Street level to support small and medium-sized businesses and make it so that people, can meet their basic needs.
So another question raised in the debate and raised from our viewers, and thank you all. Your questions are flooding in, so hopefully we'll get to them all.
Wonderful.
Was about free trade. Do you support, and I know what your position is, I've interviewed you on this before, but for the record, do you support the TPP? Do you support NAFTA? And do you support other trade agreements like the Trade and Services Agreement, or TISA?
Yeah. Critical question, because it was interesting to see that Chris Van Hollen, two things. First, he said that he didn't want to have a position on the Trans-Pacific Partnership until he read it, but I could tell you 5 years ago, when we saw that it was classified as a secret document, that members of Congress didn't have input, and that it was being written by hundreds of corporate lobbyists, that it was not going to be a good thing for the people. And also, you can't have free and fair trade. So, and there's no really such thing as free trade.
Well, that was the point made by Chris Van Hollen. We can have free trade that's also fair, and that's what a lot of people are advocating.
I don't know who's advocating for that. We can have trade, but trade has to be fair trade. It has to lift up workers around the world. It has to protect them, protect their wages, protect the environment. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as you know, is something that I've been fighting for the last 5 years. We have a project called Flush the TPP, because when we first started fighting it, nobody could remember what it was called. I'm very opposed to it. It's overall going to hurt us.
Push now to stop President Obama from passing it in the lame duck session.
He's going to try to ratify it. He's going to probably...
He's been the biggest proponent.
Absolutely, which is, concerning. So we are actually organizing an action camp and 4 days of protest in Washington, D.C. when members of Congress come back on November 14th. And people are organizing protests all across the country to try to stop it. But the Trade and Services Agreement is another area that we need to talk about very seriously, because they're coming close to finalizing those negotiations. And there's some discussion now in Washington that won't even possibly won't even go through Congress, that the president will be able to sign it and then work at the agency level to change regulations. The Trade and Services Agreement is going to irreversibly privatize our services, which is 80% of our economy. So think about the Postal Service, education, healthcare, water, all of these things we move towards privatization, and that's the wrong direction for us to be going. So I hope people will check into this and learn more about it.
And we have a question from Lauren. How can we utilize local farms to combat food deserts, the food desert crisis in Baltimore neighborhoods?
Yeah, if you see at popularresistance.org, one of our, our nonprofit group, we have a section called Create, and you can just click on Create and see all the great work that people are doing around the country to address this issue of urban food deserts through community gardens, through urban farming, through vertical farms, through food forests, and so I support all of that. I think that that we need to make healthy, organic food much more available. It will improve the health of our people and also creating more of a local food economy so that we're not driving, or shipping food long distances. That doesn't make sense with the climate crisis.
Another question we have coming in from Parrish is, do you support ending corporate personhood and publicly financing all elections in our country? The question specifically dealt with Wolfpack, and if you support Wolfpack as well.
Well, so these are two separate questions. I definitely support ending corporate personhood. Corporations are not people, money is not speech, and so that needs to happen through an amendment. But there are things that we can do in Congress, such as creating greater transparency of donors to candidates. Also, the publicly financing of elections, I fully support that, as well as equal airtime for candidates is important, and removing barriers at the local level for people to run for office. Wolfpack is an interesting approach where the concept of raising millions of dollars to elect people into Congress that are going to get rid of money. I think that we need to build a political party that is not based on getting these huge contributions. That I think Bernie Sanders showed that we can create people-funded elections and candidates who are accountable to the people, and that's what I support. And so
another point that I think it's important to raise in this context is that the latest poll did show you at 5%. Can you explain the significance of that if you were hit that 5% threshold?
Right. Well, so, and also at the federal level I think it's more important at the federal level for Jill Stein and John Mubaraka. If they hit 5%, then they will automatically be eligible for federal matching funds. And for many states across the country, it will allow them to have ballot access and not have to go through the fight that Green Party members have to go through regularly to maintain their ballot status, which really sucks up a lot of their resources and prevents them from having the resources and time to invest in building up the party structure. So I think it's very important at the federal level. I mean, it's pretty clear that Hillary Clinton's got this locked down. It's looking like a landslide. So I think this is absolutely the time for people to vote for the alternative and help us build up that political power.
Another question from Facebook sort of on this thread. Avia writes, I want the Greens to win, but how do you work with the Democrats and GOP if you were to be elected?
So I've worked on a broad range of issues, and I've worked with all sorts of members of Congress, and I will continue to do that. And in terms of issues, I'll work with those members of Congress who are supportive of the same issues. In terms of getting committee assignments and whatnot, I'll have to work with whoever's in leadership to achieve that. But I hope that being a voice, someone who's on the side of the people, who's fighting for the truth and really representing the voices of people, I hope that I will earn respect, not just from my constituents, but from other members of Congress for doing that.
Got a question from Kayla, who's our producer in the back. What is your stance on AIPAC and U.S. support for Israel?
A lot of concerns, and this is another area where I differ significantly from the other candidates. I do not think that the U.S. should be supporting, providing funding, and I oppose the increase in funds that was recently, decided upon for Israel. In terms of our foreign policy, if we want to start creating a safer and more stable world, we need to respect international law, respect human rights, and respect the sovereignty of nations. And we know the United States has already admitted that Israel is breaking international law through the illegal settlements and violating the human rights of the Palestinian people. And so we should not be funding and supporting that. And our money is going to pay for the weapons that are injuring and killing Palestinian people, including children and families.
Randy wants to know, what is your stance on open borders?
So borders, this is a complex issue, and I understand concerns about safety, and I share those as well, but I'm opposed to the level of militarization that we've created around our borders. And I remember a time when we had a much freer flow across our borders, and we need to recognize what are the roots that are driving immigration into this country. And so often it's a result of U.S. economic and military policies. And so we need to respect, again, other countries and stop interfering in their governments, as we do routinely in Latin America, and stop these types of international agreements that actually destroy the economies. People usually don't want to leave their homes and their families, but they're forced to by violence and poverty. And so we should stop creating that.
And what is your position on pay equality?
Well, I think in addition to pay equality, we need to really be talking about equity, because we're looking at generations of inequity against women, where because of the pay discrepancy, they have not been able to build up the same levels of wealth as men have through home ownership and other mechanisms, and looking at the racial disparities as well. And we know here in Baltimore very well about redlining and the hypersegregation and the differences in employment between blacks and whites in our city. And so the Green Party is one of the only parties, or is the only party that's actually talking about reparations and taking that seriously. So in addition to equality, we have a lot of work to do to build up equity in this country.
Can you talk more about why you feel like reparations for slavery, why you think that's important?
Well, because at the current rate of growth of wealth in the African American community, it would take them 228 years to match the whites in our country in terms of the level of wealth. And that's ridiculous. We know that our policies of discrimination have created this situation, and policies of disinvestment in communities, especially here in Baltimore, have created generations of poverty. And the systems that we have, are maintaining that. So in addition, it's not enough to just say, okay, now you can have money for, to start your business. Now you can have a small loan to buy a house. We need to recognize that this is really generations of theft from these communities and these populations.
So we're getting some questions about WikiLeaks. What is your reaction on, the leaks of John Podesta's emails? Hillary Clinton's campaign manager has, given us some insight into how that political machine works, but it hasn't quite been the bombshell that Julian Assange had sort of predicted. It hasn't quite changed the course of the election, and that's largely, or at least in some part, because of all the allegations of sexual assault that are coming out against Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's sad what our political discourse has become this year. I support WikiLeaks. I think that we've learned important things through these leaks. I support other whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden. I think we live in a time where there is unprecedented secrecy.
You just answered one of our other
questions. Did I? Okay, great.
Snowden.
Yeah, unprecedented secrecy, and so when you have literally, a government and a commercial media that are preventing people from having the information to understand, what's really going on, then it's important that we have people who are willing to stand up and inform us about this. And I think we need to move to much greater transparency and accountability in our government and less secrecy.
We got a follow-up from Randy. Thanks for watching, Randy. Do you also support reparations for Native Americans as well?
Yes, and I do. And also respecting their sovereignty. And we need to do some negotiations around that, how we're going to respect the treaties that we violated for so many years.
So we briefly touched upon the issue of sexual assault, and it's become forefront because of Donald Trump's campaign and the allegations put forward. What is your position on that, on combating sexual assault?
Oh, yeah, this is another issue that's really important, and it's it's a cultural issue. It's an issue about respecting and empowering, women in our society, about how are men raised in our society, and are they called out for their behaviors, and how do we, what's our whole education process for youth, for understanding sexuality? We have such a hypersexualized kind of culture that's unusual. So there's a lot of work that we need to do, education and other steps that we need to take.
So in the face of the widening gap between him and Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump has raised the specter of election fraud. He's basically been saying that millions of people, either undocumented or from the inner cities, obviously coded racial language, are gonna commit massive election fraud and gonna steal the election. What is your position on that? Is the system rigged as Donald Trump says it is?
So we don't see evidence of voter fraud in that way of, people voting more than once, all these things that are told to scare us. But we should have a lot of concern about our voting system and about the machines that are used to vote, and the fact that they're very easy to hack and that we don't have a good way to audit the election. So I'm glad that here in Maryland we've moved, towards paper ballots. I think that we need to do this across the country and make sure that our elections are monitored well, and that they are, that we can that people know that their vote was cast in the way they wanted to be voted, and that we can audit that if we need to in a very transparent way.
Another question from Will. Thanks for watching, Will. Do you support a $15 minimum wage for the state of Maryland? That proposal was recently, I guess, tabled in the city of Baltimore, and a lot of the opponents of the local measure say it needs to be passed statewide. What's your position?
Yeah, I think we should have a minimum of $15 an hour minimum wage, and we know that even that is not a living wage. People in the United States, it's really, to me, very sad that people are working full-time and still living a poverty existence, and that just should not happen. And I think in addition to creating a living wage, we do need to move towards a guaranteed basic income so that everybody can meet their basic needs. This has been tried in other places. More countries are looking at it right now, because the reality is that we are not going to be able to have a full employment in society in the future with the technological changes that we're making. So, yes, at the minimum, a $15 an hour minimum wage.
Another question from Facebook. Are you supporting Joshua Harris, who is the Green Party candidate for mayor? Are you doing any events together?
I'm glad you brought that up. Yes, I strongly support Joshua Harris, and we've worked together, for a while. He's running a citywide campaign. I'm running a statewide campaign, but we have done some events together and worked together on, talking about policy issues and things like that. And yeah, he's fantastic. I hope everybody supports Joshua Harris. He's what Baltimore City needs. He's the real complete opposite of Catherine Pugh. She wants, she's a banker. He's for a public bank that will lift up our communities. They're just she doesn't want to talk about race. He wants to use a racial equity lens in his policy. I think he's really what we need here in Baltimore City.
Can you talk about your position on factory farming and the destruction of family farms? That's another question.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of concerns about that too, because not only is factory farming, we're losing our small and medium-sized farms, especially black-owned farms, but factory farming is not good for the environment as well. And so, and this is part of what these international agreements do, is they benefit those factory farms and those larger farms, and they hurt our small and medium-sized farmers. So in some of our protests against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we've had farmers come and actually participate with us. So yes, I think I think part of the problem is that we apply regulatory criteria towards small and medium-sized farms that are really things that only the larger farms have the capacity to meet. And so we need to make sure that we're supporting our small and medium-sized farms and not putting regulations in the way that harm them. And then in terms of the Eastern Shore, we didn't talk about that enough, I guess, but the chicken farming and things there, it needs to be the corporations like Tyson and Purdue that are helping to pay to make sure that our environment is cleaned up.
All right, Margaret, so we have time for your closing statement.
Wonderful, great, thank you. This has been really fun. So I am Dr. Margaret Flowers, and I am running for U.S. Senate as a Green Party candidate, and I view this as a very necessary part of the work that I've been doing the last 10 years, pushing from the outside for social change on a broad range of issues. And now I want to take that fight into the Senate, and I'm not accepting any corporate or PAC money. I won't accept it in the future. My office will be open to the people. It's a place where you can come, and we will work together to put pressure on our members of Congress for the changes that we need. I'm not going to take the full salary that senators make. I will take the median Maryland salary, and I will invest the rest of the money that comes to me in social movement building, because that's a critical factor in terms of shifting political power. I won't take the health insurance that federal, government officials get until every single person in our country has health, coverage, because I can't. I don't want people to say, well, you've got it and I don't, and you're not going to fight for it. No, we're going to fight together to make sure we get this. This is one of my number one priorities. So if you are ready to, to really leave this kind of money-dominated system and build the political alternative that we need right now. I hope that you'll support my campaign. No matter what happens on November 8th, we're going to keep fighting, because this is really about creating the changes that we need so desperately.
All right, Margaret Flowers, thanks so much for joining us. She is the Green Party Senate candidate. She'll be on the ballot in Maryland.
I am. Right now, today, you can vote. Tomorrow.
Voting has already started in Maryland.
That's right.
So we wanted to make sure your voice is heard and you had a chance to answer the questions that the other candidates got to answer yesterday, and also questions from our viewers. So thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Jessel. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and for everyone that was here tonight to make this possible, for the Real News, and for everybody that tuned in and watched and asked questions. I hope you'll visit my website, flowersforsenate.org.
And thank you for watching The Real News, sending your questions and comments, and keep them coming, therealnews.com. Thanks so much.